Julian halts in Dacia. While the turning wheel of fortune was bringing these things about in another part of the world, Julian, among his manifold activities in Illyricum, busied himself with the inspection of the entrails of sacrifices and with observation of the flight of birds. He was eager to discover how things would end, but the answers were ambiguous and obscure and left him in doubt about the future. At last, the Gallic rhetorician Aprunculus, a master of this branch of divination, who was later promoted to the government of Narbonese Gaul, announced that he had discovered what was to come by the inspection of a liver, which he had found covered with a double layer of skin. Julian was afraid that this might be an invention designed to flatter his hopes, and was in consequence depressed. But he then experienced himself a much more convincing omen, which clearly symbolized the death of Constantius. At the very moment when the latter died in Cilicia, the soldier whose right hand was supporting Julian as he was mounting his horse slipped and fell to the ground, whereupon Julian was heard by a number of people to exclaim that the man who had raised him to his high station had fallen. But in spite of these favourable signs, his resolve to remain within the borders of Dacia was unshaken. He was still a prey to many fears and thought it rash to put his trust in forecasts which might perhaps be fulfilled in a contrary sense. Entry of Julian into Constantinople. This period of suspense was ended by the sudden arrival of the envoys Phiolaeth and Abigild, who announced that Constantius was dead, and that with his last breath he had named Julian his successor. The receipt of this news, which delivered him from a sea of troubles and the turmoil of anxiety that is inseparable from war, elated Julian beyond measure. He now put implicit faith in the predictions he had received, and knowing from experience that speed had often contributed to his successes, he ordered an advance into Thrace. The march began at once, and crossing the pass of Saki he made for Philippopolis, followed with enthusiasm by all the troops under his command. They were aware that the throne which they had been on their way to seize at the hazard of their lives had now beyond all expectations fallen into Julian's hands by way of regular succession. Surprising events are always liable to exaggeration, and from this point Julian seemed almost to fly through the air like a second Triptolemus, who traversed the earth according to the ancient legend in a chariot drawn by winged serpents. His approach inspired dread on land and sea alike, and without meeting any delays he entered Heraclea. As soon as this was known at Constantinople, the whole population, without distinction of age or sex, poured out to see him as if he had appeared from the skies. So on December the 11th he was welcomed by the respectful greeting of the Senate and the unanimous huzzas of the populace, and advanced escorted by crowds of soldiers and citizens, as if at the head of a line of battle, the object of the unwavering and wondering gaze of all. It seemed like a dream that this man of slight build, who had just reached maturity, should, after a series of notable exploits and bloody victories over kings and peoples alike, have flown from city to city with unheard-of speed, acquiring accessions of might and strength wherever he appeared, and that, after seizing everything with an ease that rivalled the flight of rumour, he should finally have received the imperial power by the decree of heaven without the infliction of any losses upon the state. Reprisals on Constantius' adherents. Shortly after this, Julian advanced Secundus Salutius to the Praetorian prefecture, and committed to his loyalty the oversight of the trials which were to be instituted. Mamertinus, Arbitio, Agillo, and Navita were to be his associates, as well as Jovianus, lately promoted to be master of horse in Illyricum. They all crossed over to Chalcedon, and in the presence of the generals and officers of the Joviani and Herculani examined those brought before them with more prejudice than impartiality, except for a few cases in which the guilt of the accused was indisputable. The first victim was Palladius, formerly master of the offices, whom they banished to Britain merely on the suspicion that he had poisoned Constantius' mind against Gallus when he was the master of the offices under Gallus as Caesar. Next, Taurus, the former praetorian prefect, was exiled to Vercellae. Though judges capable of distinguishing right from wrong might well have thought his behaviour pardonable, what crime did he commit by fleeing to the protection of his emperor from the storm that had arisen? The sentence passed on him was read with great horror, since the official report began as follows. In the consulship of Taurus and Florentius, when Taurus was summoned to stand trial, Pentadius was in danger of a similar fate. The charge against him was that he had taken notes on Constantius' behalf of the answers given by Gallus when the latter was being interrogated on several matters just before his execution, but Pentadius defended himself successfully and in the end was acquitted. By a like act of injustice, Florentius, son of Nigrinian, at that time master of the offices, was deported to the island of Bua off the Dalmatian coast. The other Florentius, an ex-praetorian prefect and actual consul, was so terrified by the sudden change in the state that he went into hiding with his wife to save himself, and could not return while Julian was alive. He was condemned to death in his absence. A similar fate befell Euagrius, count of the privy purse, Saturninus, former steward of the palace, and the ex-notary Cyrenius, who were all sent into exile, but the death of Ursulus, count of the sacred largesse, seemed to show such ingratitude in the emperor that justice herself might have wept. When Julian was sent to the west as Caesar, it was intended that he should be kept under the strictest control, and deprived of the means of making any presents to his troops, so as to leave him more exposed to the danger of mutiny. But this same Ursulus wrote to the official in charge of the treasury of Gaul with orders to pay the Caesar, without question, any sum he required. When Julian found that the death of Ursulus laid him open to reproaches and curses in many quarters, he sought to absolve himself from this unpardonable crime by declaring that it had been committed without his knowledge, and that Ursulus' destruction had been brought about by the anger of the troops, who remembered the remark which I reported him to have made when he saw Amida in ruins. Julian's lack of confidence, or his ignorance of what was fitting, was demonstrated by his choice of Arbitio, an arrogant and incorrigible double-dealer, to preside over these trials. The others, including the legionary commanders, were associated with him merely to give a show of respectability. He knew that Arbitio had been the chief threat to his own safety, as was to be expected of one who had taken a leading part in the successes of the civil war. Although the actions which I have mentioned displeased Julian's supporters, he showed in what followed a proper energy and severity. Apodemius, a former member of the Secret Service, whose mad eagerness to destroy Silvanus and Gallus I have already described, and the notary Paul, nicknamed the Chain, whose very name is enough to excite a chorus of groans, were burned alive, and thus met the fate one must have hoped for them. Beside these, Eusebius Constantius, Grand Chamberlain, a proud and cruel man, was condemned to death by the judges. He had risen from a mean station to a position of almost imperial power, which made him insufferable. Nemesis, who judges the acts of men, had tweaked him by the ear, so to say, and warned him to moderate his insolence, but he was stiff-necked, so she threw him down headlong from the peak to which she had climbed. Reforms of the court. The emperor next turned his attention to the staff of the palace, and dismissed all who were or could be comprised under this heading. In doing so, he showed a lack of concern for the discovery of truth quite unbecoming in a philosopher. It would have been commendable to keep at least those of good character and proven integrity, few though they were. It must be admitted that for the most part these people constituted such a hotbed of all of the vices that they corrupted the state by their evil passions, and did even more harm by their bad example than by the impunity with which they offended. Some of them, who had grown fat on the plunder of temples and lost no opportunity of smelling out gain, had risen at a bound from the depths of poverty to enormous riches. They had formed the habit of appropriating the property of others and bribed, robbed, and squandered without restraint of any kind. Here the seeds of loose living found a fertile soil. Men ceased to regard truth or reputation, and mad pride led them to stain their credit by the criminal pursuit of gain. With this went the growth of gluttony and of prodigal expenditure on their bellies. Triumphs in battle were replaced by triumphs at the table. Silk and other fine textures were used more and more lavishly, and the kitchen became the object of ever keener attention. Grand sites for luxuriously furnished houses were eagerly snapped up. The dimensions of these were such that if the consul Cincinnatus had owned an equivalent area in farmland, he would have lost the reputation of being a poor man even after his dictatorship. These moral blemishes were accompanied by shameful deficits in military discipline. Instead of the traditional chants, the troops practiced effeminate music hall songs. The soldier's bed was no longer a stone, as of old, but a yielding down mattress. Their cups were heavier than their swords, since they now thought it beneath them to drink from earthenware, and they expected to be housed in marble, although it is recorded in ancient history that a Spartan soldier was severely punished for daring to appear under a roof at all during a campaign. Moreover, the troops of this period were brutal and greedy in their behaviour to their own people, and weak and cowardly in the face of the enemy. In consequence, they led an idle life in which they became rich by wire-pulling and adept at judging the quality of gold and precious stones, a trait foreign to the military character even in recent times. Everyone knows the story of the common soldier in the army of the Caesar Maximian, who, finding a Parthian jewel case full of pearls among the loot of a sacked Persian fort, threw away the contents because he did not know their value, and went off delightedly simply with the polished leather of the receptacle. At this same time there occurred the following incident. A barber who had been sent for to trim the emperor's hair presented himself splendidly dressed. Julian was astonished at his appearance, and said, "I sent for a barber, not a treasury official." Then he asked what the man earned by his trade, and was told that it brought him in every day 20 men's allowance of bread and a proportionate amount of fodder for his beasts, reckoned by what are commonly called heads, as well as a substantial annual salary and many profitable prerequisites. Julian's reaction was to dismiss the whole category of these people, together with cooks and the like, who were in the habit of receiving about the same amount. He declared that he had no use for their services, and told them to take themselves off where they pleased. Julian openly professes paganism. Although Julian from his earliest boyhood had nursed an inclination towards the worship of the pagan gods, which gradually grew into an ardent passion as he grew older, fear of the consequences had kept him from praising these gods in rites except in the greatest possible secrecy. Now, however, that this fear was removed, and he saw that the time had come when he could do as he liked, he revealed what was in his heart, and directed in plain unvarnished terms that the temples should be opened, sacrifices brought to their altars, and the worship of the old gods restored. To make this ordinance more effective, he summoned to the palace the Christian bishops, who were far from being of one mind, together with their flocks, who were no less divided by schism, and warned them in polite terms to lay aside their differences and allow every man to practice his belief boldly, without hindrance. His motive in insisting on this was that he knew that toleration would intensify their divisions and that henceforth he would no longer have to fear a unanimous public opinion. Experience had taught him that no wild beasts are such dangerous enemies to a man as Christians are to one another. Believing that he was following an example set long before by the Emperor Marcus, he would often say, "The Alemanni and the Franks listened to me, so I expect you to listen." But he did not observe that the two cases were quite different. Marcus' complaint was uttered when he was passing through Palestine on his way to Egypt and was frequently disgusted by the disturbances made by the filthy Jews. What he is supposed to have said was, "Oh, for the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians! At last I have found a people more disorderly than they." Egyptian litigants sent home. At this moment, various rumours prompted the arrival of a number of Egyptians. Egyptians are a contentious race, who take delight in the complexities of litigation, and are particularly eager to demand excessive compensation for any payment that they have been constrained to make, so as either to escape their debt altogether, or at any rate to have the convenience of postponing its discharge. Another of their tricks is to threaten the rich with a prosecution for extortion, which they will be anxious to avoid. Chattering like jackdaws, these people thrust themselves in a disorderly crowd upon the emperor himself, and the praetorian prefects, demanding the restitution of sums which they declare that they had paid, justly or not, to several persons about 70 years earlier. They brought all other business to a stop, so the emperor published an order that they should all go over to Chalcedon, promising that he would come himself shortly and settle all their claims. Once they had crossed, stringent orders were given to the captains of the ferry boats not to allow an Egyptian on board. The strict observance of this ban put an end to this obstinate attempt at blackmail, and they all went home disappointed of their hopes. As a result, a law was passed under what one could only call the direct inspiration of justice, which provided that no patron could be challenged in respect of payments which it was established that he had fairly received. Julian at Constantinople, AD 362. The new year came, and the names of Mamertinus and Novita were added to the list of those who had held the consulship. The emperor displayed his condescension by attending their inauguration on foot with the other persons of distinction. This won him credit with some, but others criticised it as a cheap affectation. This was followed by a show given by Mamertinus in the circus, at which it was traditional to confer freedom on a number of slaves. When they were led in by a deputy master of ceremonies, the emperor himself hastily pronounced the usual formula, "Proceed according to law." When he was reminded that by doing so on that day he had infringed the rights of another magistrate, he fined himself £10 in gold for the mistake he had made. He was frequently in the Senate House to settle the numerous disputed points which arose. One day when he was hearing cases there, he was told that the philosopher Maximus had arrived from Asia. He forgot himself so far as to leap up in an undignified haste, run out some way from the anteroom, kiss Maximus and bring him into the chamber with every mark of respect. By this unseemly performance he showed himself excessively anxious for empty distinctions, forgetting the splendid saying of Cicero, who criticises such ambition in the following words: "Those same philosophers inscribe their own names on the very books which they write, urging men to despise glory." This shows their desire for reputation and recognition in the very act of preaching contempt for such distinctions. Soon afterwards, 2 members of the Secret Service who had been dismissed approached Julian confidentially, and offered in return for their reinstatement to reveal where Florentius was hiding. He rebuked them, and called them informers, adding that it was beneath an emperor to avail himself of underhanded means to detect a man who had gone into hiding to save his life, and who perhaps would not be allowed to remain long in that condition without hope of pardon. In all these incidents he was attended by Praetextatus, a man of distinguished ability and a dignity reminiscent of times gone by. He happened to be at Constantinople on private business, and Julian on his own initiative appointed him governor of Achaia, with the power of a proconsul. But although he devoted such attention to the reform of civil abuses, Julian did not on that account neglect military matters. He gave the army commanders of proved experience, strengthened all the cities of Thrace as well as the frontier fortifications, and took particular care that the troops posted along the Danube, of whose watchfulness and energy in the face of barbarian attacks he heard good reports, should not lack either arms and clothing or pay and food. While he was thus engaged in showing that he would not tolerate any slackness, his closest advisers urged that he should attack the neighbouring Goths, who were often unreliable and treacherous. He replied that he was looking for a worthier foe. The Goths would be dealt with adequately by the slave traders of Galatia, who offered them for sale in all parts without distinction of status. In these pursuits he gained among foreign peoples a reputation for courage, restraint, military skill, and a host of good qualities, which gradually spread over the whole world. The widespread fear of his coming led both his neighbours and those far away to send delegations to him in unusual haste. From one quarter the peoples beyond the Tigris and the Armenians sued for peace. From another, Indian peoples as far removed as Ceylon and other islands took time by the forelock and vied with each other in sending grandees with gifts. From the south, the Moors offered their services to the Roman state. From the north and the solitary regions through which the Phasis flows into the Black Sea, the Bosphorani and other previously unknown tribes sent envoys with the humble request that on payment of an annual tribute they might be left to live in peace in the land of their birth. A description of Thrace and the Black Sea. One more thing filled Julian's cup of joy to the brim, an event long hoped for but delayed by a complex combination of factors. Agillo and Jovius, who was later quaestor, brought the news that the defenders of Aquileia, sick of the long siege, had opened their gates and surrendered on hearing of the death of Constantius. The ringleaders of the revolt had been handed over and, as I have already told, were burned alive. All the rest had been granted an amnesty and pardon for their offences. Julian's march to Antioch. Such was Julian's elation at these successes that he began to entertain ambitions too high for a mortal. After all the dangers to which he had been exposed, the Roman world was now at peace under his sway. He enjoyed all the worldly glory and prosperity that the bounty of a smiling fortune could bestow, and the honours of his former victories were enhanced by the fact that, while he was sole emperor, no internal disturbance menaced his rule, and no barbarian dared to break his proper bounds. All people, in fact, abandoning their craving for aggression, which they now realised brought nothing but loss and injury, united with wonderful enthusiasm in singing and praises. So after settling with calm deliberations all the problems posed by the various exigencies of the times, and encouraging his troops by frequent speeches and adequate pay to greater keenness in the discharge of their duty, he set out for Antioch at the height of his popularity, leaving Constantinople in much better case than he found it. He had been born there, and he loved and cherished it because it was his native place. crossing the Bosphorus and passing by Chalcedon and Libissa, where Hannibal the Carthaginian is buried, he came to the once famous city of Nicomedia, which the lavish expenditure of former emperors had enriched with such a multitude of buildings, both public and private, that discerning critics reckoned it practically a region of the Eternal City. Julian found its walls a pathetic heap of ashes, and silent tears testified to his sorrows as he made his slow way to the palace. The feature of the city's plight which particularly distressed him was that the local senate and people, who had formerly been immensely prosperous, met him dressed in mourning. Some of them he recognised, having been brought up at Nicomedia by the bishop Eusebius, who was distantly related to him. He made a generous contribution, as he had elsewhere, to the cost of repairing the damage done by the earthquake, and went on past Nicaea to the borders of Galatia. Here he made a detour to the right to visit the ancient shrine of the Great Mother at Persinus. This is the town from which her image was brought to Rome by Scipio Nasica during the Second Punic War, in obedience to an instruction found in the Sibylline books. I have included a short digression on her arrival in Italy, together with some other relevant matters, in my account of the reign of the Emperor Commodus. Authorities disagree on the origin of the name Pessinus. Some hold that the town is so called because the image of the goddess fell from heaven, Pessin being the Greek for to fall. Others maintain that it was Ilus, son of Tros and king of Dardania, who gave the place this name after a war in which many fell. Theopompus, however, says that it was not Ilus but Midas, the once mighty king of Phrygia. After worshipping the goddess and soliciting her favour by sacrifices and prayers, Julian returned to Ankara. As he was leaving it, he was beset by a huge mob. Some demanded the return of property of which they had been forcibly deprived. Others complained that they had been unfairly conscripted into the local council. A number showed such insane disregard for their own safety as to level charges of high treason against their opponents. Julian, however, weighed every case with more than the strictness of a Cassius or a Lycurgus, and gave each man his due. He never deviated from the truth or showed particular severity towards slanderers, whom he hated because he had himself been the object of their malady when he was still a humble private citizen, and they had almost cost him his life. There are many instances of the patience which he showed in matters of this kind, but a single illustration will suffice. A man was pressing a charge of treason in intemperate language against a personal enemy, with whom he was on terms of bitter hostility. The emperor turned a deaf ear, but the accuser went on with the same story day after day. At last Julian asked him who was the object of this attack, and was told that he was a wealthy citizen. "What makes you think him guilty?" said Julian with a smile. "He is making himself a purple robe out of a silk cloak." Thinking him a worthless creature making a serious charge against another of his own kidney, Julian told him to hold his tongue and take himself off out of harm's way. But he still persisted. The emperor grew sick of this whole matter. He turned to the Count of the Largesse, whom he saw standing near, and said, "Have a pair of purple shoes given to this lousy chatterbox to take to his enemy, who, so I am given to understand, has already made himself a robe of the same colour. This will teach him what cheap rags are worth without great power." But although such behaviour was praiseworthy, and deserves to be imitated by good rulers, it was nevertheless harsh and reprehensible that in Julian's time anybody who a town council wished to co-opt could hardly obtain fair treatment, even if he was entitled to exemption by special privileges, or by length of service in the army, or by the clearest evidence that he was of totally alien extraction. This went so far that many people bought themselves off by clandestine payments from the vexatious burdens which terrified them. Julian pursued his journey, and when he reached the gates which divided Cappadocia from Cilicia, he greeted the governor of the latter with a kiss, gave him a seat in his carriage, and took him with him to Tarsus. The governor's name was Celsus, and he had been known to Julian since they were students together at Athens. He was now in a hurry to see Antioch, the magnificent jewel of the East. He approached the city by the usual stages, and was received by the worshipping populace as if he was a god. The cries of the great crowd shouting that a lucky star had risen over the east filled him with wonder. As it happened, his arrival coincided with the annual celebration of an ancient rite in honour of Adonis. According to the legend, Adonis was the darling of Venus, and was fatally wounded by a boar, an event which symbolises the reaping of crops at harvest. It seemed a sad omen that the emperor should make his first entrance into the great city, where princes dwelt, to the accompaniment of general wailing and sounds of grief. At Antioch he gave a proof of his mild and patient temper, which was trivial in itself but none the less remarkable. He hated a certain Thalassius, a former deputy master of petitions, because he had intrigued against his brother Gallus. Thalassius was consequently forbidden to take his place among the notables who greeted the emperor, and the next day some enemies of his, with whom he had a lawsuit, gathered a crowd of supporters and came to Julian shouting, "Your Majesty's enemy has forcefully seized our property." Julian saw that this was a chance to destroy the man, but answered, "I realise that the man you speak of has given me just cause of offence. Nevertheless, you would do well to keep quiet until he has given satisfaction to me, who am his principal enemy." He then gave instructions to the prefect in attendance that the case should not be heard until he himself was reconciled to Thalassius, which soon after came about. Julian at Antioch. The winter was passed at Antioch in accordance with Julian's wishes, but he remained proof against all the temptations to sensuality which Syria offers in such abundance. He appeared to find his recreation in judicial business, which presented him with a variety of problems no less difficult than those of war. He was admirably patient in weighing evidence so as to give every man his due and reach a just decision, whether it was a question of inflicting moderate punishment on the guilty or protecting the innocent from inroads upon their property. Although in examination he sometimes showed lack of tact, asking at an inappropriate moment what religion each of the parties professed. One cannot point to any decision by him which flew in the face of the evidence, nor could he ever be accused of having deviated from the path of strict equity because of a man's religion or for any other reason. A right and acceptable judgment is one which draws the line between what is just and unjust after a minute examination of all of the facts, and Julian was as careful to steer a straight course as a sailor anxious to avoid running on a rock. He owed his success in this to the fact that he was conscious of the excitability of his disposition and allowed his prefects and close associates freedom to curb his impetuosity by timely advice when it led him astray. On many occasions he made it clear that he regretted his mistakes and that he was glad to be put right. When advocates for the defence praised him to the skies for his perfect uprightness, he is said to have replied with much feeling, "I should certainly be glad and proud if I knew that this praise came from people who were also in a position to blame me for anything that I had said or done amiss." Of the many instances of his mild behaviour on the bench, it will be enough to mention one, which is neither irrelevant nor without point. A woman was once brought before him, who was surprised to see that her adversary one of the palace staff who had been dismissed, was still wearing his belt of office. When she complained loudly of this act of impudence, the emperor said, "Go on, woman, if you think that you have been wronged. As for this man, he is only wearing his belt to get through the mire more easily. It can do no harm to your cause." Incidents such as these led people to believe, as he himself constantly asserted, that the ancient goddess of justice, who according to Aratus fled to heaven in disgust at the wickedness of mankind, had returned to earth during his reign. This would be easier to accept if Julian had not sometimes followed his own inclination rather than the letter of the law, and dimmed the lustre of his many glorious acts by occasional errors. It is true that, among other things, he reformed certain laws by pruning them of ambiguities and making it perfectly clear what they enjoined or forbade, but he was guilty of one harsh act which should be buried in lasting oblivion. He banned adherents of Christianity from practising as teachers of rhetoric or literature. Riots at Alexandria. At this same period, the notary Gaudentius, who, as I have told, had been sent by Constantius to oppose Julian in Africa, and another Julian, a former vice-prefect, who had been very active on the same side, were brought back under arrest and put to death. Artemius also, who had commanded the troops in Egypt and who was charged by the people of Alexandria with a mass of outrageous crimes, paid the supreme penalty. Next, the son of Marcellus, at one time master of both cavalry and infantry, was publicly executed on the grounds that he had plotted to seize the throne. Beside these, Romanus and Vincentius, tribunes of the first and second divisions of Scutari, were convicted of nursing designs above their station and sent into exile. After a brief interval, the people of Alexandria heard of the death of Artemius. They had been afraid that he would return, as he threatened, with his power restored, to take revenge on the many people who had injured him. Now, however, they turned their rage upon their bishop George, a human snake who had often made them suffer from his poisonous fangs. George was born, they say, in a fuller's shop in the Cilician town of Epiphania, and rose in the world to be the instrument of many people's ruin. Finally, against his own interest as well as the state's, he was consecrated Bishop of Alexandria, a city given to frequent, spontaneous and unmotivated outbreaks of violence. George himself acted as a powerful irritant to the savage temper of the populace by proceeding to denounce a number of people to Constantius, who was always ready to listen on the grounds that they had disobeyed his commands. In doing this, he forgot the faith he professed, which preaches only justice and mercy, and descended to the abominable trade of an informer. Among other pieces of malicious information which he fed to Constantius, he was said to have told him that all the buildings on the soil of the said city, which had been erected by its founder Alexander at great public expense, sought in consequence to be a source of profit to the treasury. All these mischievous deeds were crowned by another, which in a short time brought him to utter destruction. On his way back from the emperor's court, attended as usual by a large crowd, he looked in passing at the fine temple of the city's protecting deity and remarked, "How long shall this sepulchre stand?" Many of his hearers were thunderstruck by these words, and fearing that he would attempt to destroy the temple, devoted all their energies to plotting his downfall. Suddenly there arrived the glad tidings that Artemius was no more. The whole population went wild with joy at this unexpected piece of good news. They fell upon George, howling and yelling, beat him about, trampled on him, and finally spread-eagled him and finished him off. Dracontius, the superintendent of the mint, and a certain Diodorus, who was thought to be in league with him, had ropes tied to their legs and were killed at the same time. The former had overturned an altar recently set up in the mint which he controlled, and the latter, while directing the building of a church, had taken the liberty of cropping the curls of some boys, because he thought that long hair was a feature of the worship of the heathen. Not content with this, the brutal mob loaded the multitude of mutilated bodies on camels and took them to the beach, where they burned them and threw their ashes into the sea, for fear that the remains might be collected and have a church built over them. This had happened in other cases, when men persecuted for their religion endured torture until they met a glorious death with their faith unspotted, and are now called martyrs. The wretched victims of these cruel sufferings might have been saved by the help of their fellow Christians, had not the whole population been inflamed by universal hatred of George. When news of this outrage reached the emperor, his anger was roused, and he was on the point of exacting the supreme penalty from the authors of this abominable crime, but he was pacified by those nearest to him, who urged him to be lenient. So he issued a proclamation in which he expressed his horror in sharp terms, and threatened extreme measures if any similar breach of the law were committed in future. Preparations for war with Persia. Meanwhile, preparations went on for war with Persia, which had long been part of Julian's lofty designs. He was passionately eager to avenge the past, knowing from experience as well as report that for almost 60 years this fierce people had stamped cruel evidence of carnage and rapine upon the east, and had often utterly annihilated our armies. Two causes intensified his longing for war. In the first place, he was tired of inactivity and dreamed of trumpets and of battles, and in the second he was on fire to add the title of Parthicus to the glorious record of his exploits. In the first flower of his youth he had to encounter the arms of savage peoples, and the recollection that he had received supplications from kings and princes who had been expected to resist to the last rather than surrender was still warm in his mind. Seeing the scale and speed of his preparations, his idle and malicious detractors put it about that it was shameful and disastrous that the change of a single person should lead to so untimely an upheaval. They made every effort to get the campaign postponed, and kept saying in the hearing of those whom they believed to be in a position to report it to the emperor that if he did not show more restraint in the use of his extraordinary prosperity, his very advantages would bring him to grief, like a plant which outgrows its strength in too fertile a soil. But their long and loud agitation achieved nothing. Julian was a man impervious to insults behind his back, and no more affected by the barking of his critics than Hercules by the pygmies, or Theodamus the yokel of Lindus. His great spirit put him in a different class from other men. He was as determined as ever on this grand campaign, and pushed on all the necessary preparations with the utmost energy. Nevertheless, the victims with whose blood he drenched the altars of the gods were all too numerous. On occasion he sacrificed 100 bulls and countless flocks of other animals, as well as white birds, for which he combed land and sea. The result was seen in the intemperate habits of the troops, who were gorged with meat and demoralized by a craving for drink, so that almost every day some of them were carried through the streets to their quarters on the shoulders of passers-by after debaucheries in the temples, which called for punishment rather than indulgence. Conspicuous in this respect were the Petulantes and Celts, whose indiscipline at this time passed all bounds. Ceremonial rites, too, were performed with increased and excessive frequency, at a heavy cost hitherto quite unheard of. Anyone who professed a knowledge of divination, whether qualified or not, was allowed to consult oracles and examine entrails, which sometimes revealed the future, all this without any sort of restriction or the observance of any prescribed rules. Ostentatiously varied methods were employed. The notes and flight of birds, and omens in general, were studied in the hope that reliable information about the future could somehow be obtained. He gave vent to his fury at the obstinacy of his critics by composing a satire on them, called the Antiochian Beard Hater. in which he enumerated the defects of the city in no friendly terms, and in some respects went beyond the truth. They retaliated by circulating a number of jests at his expense, which for the moment he had to pretend to take in good part, though in fact he was boiling with suppressed wrath. He was caricatured as a monkey, or as a dwarf who tried to impress by squaring his narrow shoulders, wearing a goateed beard, and taking big strides like a brother of Otus and Ephialtes, who were Homeric giants of enormous height. The number of his sacrifices earned him the nickname of Axeman instead of priest, and he was justly criticised for the ostentatious delight which he took in carrying the sacred objects himself instead of leaving the task to the inferior priesthood, and in being attended by companies of women. But in spite of his anger at insults of this sort, he held his peace, kept his temper under control, and went on with his solemnities. Finally, on the appointed feast day, he ascended the rounded slopes of Mount Cassius, a hill clothed in woods, from which one can get one's first sight of the sun at second cockcrow. He was sacrificing to Jove when he suddenly saw a man lying prostrate on the ground, begging for life and pardon. Julian asked his name and was told that he was Theodotus, the former governor of Hierapolis, who among other nobles had escorted Constantius from that town and had flattered him shamefully in the belief that he would undoubtedly emerge as the victor. Shedding crocodile tears, he had begged Constantius to send them the head of the ungrateful rebel Julian to be paraded about in the same way as he had remembered happening with the head of Magnentius. This elicited the following reply from Julian: "A number of people have already told me this story, but put aside all fear and go home in peace. You owe this to the mercy of a prince who has taken to heart the words of the sage and is eager to lessen the number of his enemies and increase that of his friends." When he left at the conclusion of the ceremony, a letter was brought to him from the governor of Egypt, announcing that after a long and laborious search they had at last been able to find a new Apis bull. The inhabitants of those parts believe that this is a lucky sign which portends a good harvest and various other blessings. This calls for a brief explanation. Of the animals traditionally held sacred, Nervis and Apis are the best known. Nervis is sacred to the sun, and nothing of special note is reported of him. Apis belongs to the moon. He is a bull distinguished by various birthmarks, in particular by the shape of the crescent moon on his right flank. After living his appointed span, which is prescribed by the obscure authority of certain occult books and may not be exceeded, he is killed by drowning in a sacred pool. And with the same ritual, a heifer, also marked in a particular way which has been found and presented to him. His death is followed by public mourning and the search for another Apis. If one can be found which perfectly meets the criteria, he is brought to Memphis, a city famous for the frequent visits of the god Asclepius. 100 priests welcome him and escort him to his stall. From that moment he is an object of worship and is said to give clear indications of coming events. Sometimes he gives an unfavourable response by repulsing those who approach him. We are told, for example, that on one occasion he turned away from Germanicus Caesar, who was offering him food, and thus gave a sign of what soon afterwards came to pass. The provinces and cities of Egypt. Egypt itself, which ever since it has formed part of the Roman Empire has been ruled by prefects, is adorned by the great cities of Athribis, Oxyrhynchus, Theumis, and Memphis, not to mention many lesser towns. But the crown of all cities is Alexandria, which is enriched by many splendid features through the ingenuity of its founder and his architect Dianocrates. The latter, when laying out the long circuits of its fine walls, found that there was a temporary shortage of lime-induced flour instead to mark its boundary. This accident was a sign that a future city would enjoy an ample supply of food. Healthful breezes blow there, the air is calm and mild, and the experience of many generations has shown that there is hardly a day on which the inhabitants do not see a cloudless sky. The approach by sea is treacherous and brought many early navigators to grief. This led Cleopatra to erect in the harbour a high tower, which takes its name of Pharos from the place itself. This made it possible to show a light to ships arriving in darkness. Before that, vessels coming from the Parthian or Libyan Sea, with no landmark of mountain or hill on the broad curved shore to guide them, ran aground on the soft sticky sand and broke up. This same queen built with almost incredible speed the extraordinarily massive mole known as the Hypestation. The emergency which inspired it is well known. The island of Pharos, where Homer in somewhat pompous language places focus and his herd of seals, lay a mile from the city on the mainland, and was subject to a payment of tribute to the Rhodians. One day when the collectors arrived from Rhodes with an exorbitant assessment, the queen, who was never lacking in resources, took them with her to a place outside the city on the pretext of a religious celebration, and gave orders that the work should go on without a pause until it was finished. In 7 days, by building a causeway out to the sea, as many furlongs were reclaimed for the land. The queen drove to the spot and laughed at the Rhodians for their blunder in demanding tax for what was not an island but part of the mainland. There are also many temples with lofty roofs, chief among them the Temple of Serapis. Its splendour is such that mere words can only do it an injustice, but its great halls of columns and its wealth of lifelike statues and other works of art make it, next to the Capitol, which is the symbol of the eternity of immemorial Rome, the most magnificent building in the whole world. It contained 2 priceless libraries. Ancient records are unanimous in their evidence that 700,000 volumes brought together by the sleepless energy of the Ptolemies went up in flames under the dictator Caesar when the city was sacked in the Alexandrian War. 12 miles from Alexandria is Nopus, which tradition says is named after Menelaus steersman, who was buried there. It is an exceptionally delightful place, well supplied with agreeable inns and fanned by soft airs. The climate is healthy, and a visitor to that region listening to the murmur of the breeze in the sunny atmosphere might well think himself transported to another world. Alexandria itself has not grown gradually like other cities, but has covered a wide area from its very foundation. For a long time it was prey to bitter internal dissensions, until finally, during the reign of Aurelian, the quarrels of the citizens reached the proportion of a civil war. The walls were destroyed, and it lost the greater part of the district called Brachion, which for a long time had been the chosen abode of outstanding men. Here dwelt Aristarchus, who excelled in the thorny topic of grammar, Herodian, who investigated the minutiae of learning, Ammianus Saccus, the teacher of Plotinus, and many other writers in various branches of humane studies. Among these, Didymus was preeminent. He owed his reputation to his encyclopedic knowledge, although in 6 books of generally unsuccessful criticism of Cicero, in which he imitates the scurrilous writers of satirical verses, he sounds to the ears of the learned like a puppy dog feebly yelping from a safe distance at a grimly roaring lion. These that I have mentioned and many others flourished in the early days of the city, but even now the voice of learning in its various branches is not silent. Teaching in different disciplines still somehow survives. The mathematician's rule brings hidden truths to light. Music is not wholly dried up among them or harmony dumb. Some, though not many, still keep warm the study of the movement of the earth and the stars, and there are others who are skilled in the science of the number. Beside these, there are few who are expert in divination, the study of medicine too, whose help is often needed in a society which is neither frugal nor sober, advances every day. For a doctor to be able to say that he received his training in Alexandria is sufficient to recommend his skill. No practice of practical demonstration is needed, though in fact everything that he does smacks of his medical school. So much for that subject. But anyone who cares to engage in a brisk review of the multifarious books on knowledge of the divine and the origin of prognostics will find that the source from which learning of this kind has spread throughout the world is Egypt. It was there that men long before others discovered various religions in what may be called their cradle, and now carefully preserving the origins of worship in their esoteric scriptures. Training in this sphere taught Pythagoras to worship the gods in secret, gave unquestioned authority to whatever he said or did, and caused him often to exhibit his golden thigh at Olympia and to be frequently seen in colloquy with an eagle. Egypt taught Anaxagoras to foretell a rain of meteorites and to predict earthquakes by the feel of mud in a well. Solon too was helped by the dicta of the priests of Egypt in framing his legal code, which was given the Romans their law in its strongest support. Plato drew on this source, and it was after a visit to Egypt that he achieved his highest flights in language, whose sublimity rivalled Jove himself, and served with glory on the field of wisdom. The people of Egypt are for the most part rather swarthy and dark, and have a gloomy cast of countenance. They are lean and have a dried-up look, are easily roused to excited gestures, and are quarrelsome and most persistent in pursuing a debt. It puts a man to the blush if he cannot exhibit a number of welts incurred by refusing to pay tribute, and nobody has yet been able to devise a torture harsh enough to compel a hardened robber from that country to reveal his name against his will. Everybody knows from early histories that the whole of Egypt was formerly ruled by kings who were friendly to Rome, but after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, it was occupied by Octavian and given the status of a province. We acquired the dry part of Libya by the last will of King Apion. Cyrene and the other cities of Libya came to us through the generosity of Ptolemy. After this long digression, I will resume my main theme.